I paid for his college, his wedding, and every bill since his mother died. Then he said, "We're not running a charity, Dad. Get a job or get out." So I took the job he offered and fired him from it. Before we begin, please subscribe, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? The day I retired wasn't the end of my working life. It was the beginning of my family's collapse. They just didn't know it yet. 40 years, 4 decades of hauling freight schedules, managing logistics routes, and keeping Pacific Northwest commerce moving through rain, snow, and corporate mergers. At 65, I'd earned my rest. My back ached from years of warehouse inspections, my hands bore the calluses of honest work, and my bank account, well, that told a story my family never bothered to read. 2 years since Margaret passed. Cancer took her slow and mean, leaving me rattling around this house like a ghost. That's when Ryan suggested I move in with him and Tracy. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone," he'd said, all concern and warm smiles. I thought it was love. Turns out it was convenience. I kept my financial situation quiet, always had. Raised Ryan to understand the value of hard work, not inherited wealth. So when I helped with groceries, utilities, and repairs, they saw a generous father struggling on a pension. They never saw the investment portfolios, the dividend statements, or the stake in a certain Seattle-based logistics company that had grown quite nicely over the years. Tonight felt special. I'd picked up a bottle of our celebration wine, the good stuff we saved for anniversaries and promotions. The dining room table was set properly, candles lit, even put on my best shirt. Ryan was cutting into his steak, Tracy swirling her glass like she did when she wanted to appear sophisticated. "So," I said, raising my glass with what I hoped was a proud smile, 40 years with Maritime Pacific Freight. As of today, I'm officially retired." The silence hit like a sledgehammer. Ryan's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Tracy's wineglass stopped mid-swirl. Neither moved. Neither smiled. The candle flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across their suddenly stone faces. 40 years, I repeated, my voice smaller now. Thought we could finally celebrate. Tracy set her glass down with deliberate precision. Celebrate? With what money? The words punched through my chest. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as Ryan cleared his throat, suddenly looking like the corporate manager he'd become. All business, no warmth. "Dad, let's be realistic about household finances here." His tone was patronizing, like he was explaining budgets to a child. "You're now an extra mouth to feed, with no income coming in." I stared at him. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid without blinking. $24,500 for Western Bay University. $9,200 for his wedding. Countless grocery runs, utility bills, and repair costs over the past 2 years. "I've worked my whole life for this moment," I managed. "Well, that moment's over." Ryan's voice had an edge now. "We're not running a charity here, Dad. You need to find work. Immediately." Tracy leaned forward, her accountant's brain already calculating. "Doug across the street bags groceries at Safeway. He's 73. You're 65, not an invalid. Flipping burgers, cleaning offices, I don't care what." Ryan was warming up now, finding his rhythm. "But you will work, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." Tracy nodded, adding with casual cruelty, "1 week. Figure it out, or we'll figure out something permanent." I sat there, wine glass trembling in my hand, watching my son and daughter-in-law destroy 40 years of sacrifice with 10 minutes of conversation. They'd already moved on, returning to casual dinner chat about their days, leaving me drowning in the wreckage of assumptions I'd apparently made about love, family, and what it meant to raise a child. Later, clearing their plates while they laughed at some sitcom in the living room, I heard Tracy's voice carry from the couch. At least now he knows where he stands. That night, staring at my bedroom ceiling, the numbers ran through my head like a broken calculator. 24,500, 9,200, thousands more in quiet support. The modest room around me wasn't poverty. It was choice. I'd always preferred to be seen as a generous father rather than a wealthy man. But through the thin walls, I heard them talking. Low voices, thinking I was asleep. He thinks this is still 1980. Ryan's voice drifted through. Wait till he sees next month's heating bill. Tracy's laugh was sharp. If he refuses to work, we'll take control of his pension. Then we can look into assisted living facilities. Ryan chuckled. Beggars can't be choosers, right? My hands clenched into fists under the covers. White knuckles. 40 years of sacrifice reduced to begging. They hadn't just planned this conversation. They'd choreographed it. The retirement announcement was simply their cue to begin. Memories flooded back, teaching Ryan to throw a curveball in the backyard, staying up all night when he had pneumonia at age 7. The pride in his eyes when I attended his high school graduation. When had gratitude become entitlement? When had love become transaction? I sat on the edge of my bed until dawn, something cold and calculating settling in my chest. They thought they'd broken me. They thought 40 years of quiet generosity made me weak. Tomorrow I'd accept their terms. I'd find work. I'd play the role of the broken-down old man they needed me to be. Because they didn't know who they were dealing with. They'd forgotten that quiet men aren't always weak men, and they'd never learned that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. Let them think I'm just another burden. Tomorrow, I'll start reminding them who built this house and who can take it apart, brick by brick. Revenge doesn't begin with rage. It begins with obedience. The next morning, I walked into that kitchen wearing the mask I'd spent all night crafting. Calm, agreeable, defeated, but not bitter. Ryan was gulping coffee like it was medicine, tie askew, already running late for another day of mediocrity at Easton Dynamics. Tracy sat across from him, stabbing her yogurt with mechanical precision, her laptop open to what looked like expense reports. "Morning," I said quietly, pouring myself coffee from the pot they never offered to share. "I thought about what you both said last night." Ryan's spoon clinked against his bowl. Tracy's fingers paused over her keyboard. "You're right," I continued, letting my voice carry just the right amount of resignation. A man my age should contribute to the household. I was being selfish. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Tracy's shoulders relaxed. Ryan's chest puffed out slightly, the look of a man who'd won an argument he thought might drag on for weeks. "Well," Tracy said, not quite managing to hide her smug satisfaction. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Ryan nodded, suddenly magnanimous in victory. "See, Dad? Turns out you can be reasonable after all when you really think things through." I smiled, a small humble thing that made my stomach turn. I'll do what needs to be done. That's when Ryan delivered the first gift I hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair, corporate authority radiating from his polyester blend suit, and made an offer that would have been insulting if it wasn't so perfectly stupid. "Actually, I might be able to help you out," he said, like he was doing me the favor of a lifetime. "We need a night janitor at Easton. Minimum wage, no benefits, but it's honest work." I blinked slowly, as if processing this generous opportunity. "Easton Dynamics? Your company?" "Yeah. I talked to Mr. Haynes about it yesterday. Richard Haynes, he's the CEO. Good guy, understands family situations." Ryan was practically glowing with his own benevolence. "I vouched for you, told him you were reliable despite your age." If only he knew. Richard Haynes. We'd shaken hands over coffee 26 years ago when his company was 3 guys in a rented garage, dreaming about revolutionizing freight logistics software. I'd written him a check for $500,000, half my life savings at the time, because I believed in his vision. Today, Easton Dynamics employed over 3,000 people across the Pacific Northwest, with offices in Portland, Spokane, and Vancouver. And Ryan, my brilliant son, was offering me a janitor position at a company I owned 37% of. "That's very generous," I said carefully. "Mr. Haynes sounds like a good man." "He is. Fair but firm. Expects people to pull their weight." Ryan checked his watch, already mentally moving on to his important day of middle management. "You'd start Monday. Night shift, 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. Think you can handle that?" I nodded slowly, like an old man grateful for scraps. Honest work is honest work. Tracy looked up from her laptop with something approaching warmth. "It's nice to see you taking responsibility, Harold. We were worried you'd be stubborn about this." The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday at the Seattle Public Library, ostensibly reading newspapers, but actually researching Tracy's company, Lennox and Frost Consulting, public records, client lists, business filings. Sunday, I took a long walk around Green Lake, thinking through 26 years of deliberate invisibility. See, when Richard's company started growing, I'd made a choice. I could have taken an active role, become the public face of success, enjoyed the lifestyle that comes with building an empire. Instead, I'd stayed silent, anonymous. I wanted Ryan to grow up normal, to understand that respect was earned through character, not inherited through wealth. I'd hidden my stake behind shell companies and legal trusts, content to watch my investment grow while living like any other middle-class father. But that humility had been mistaken for poverty, and that mistake was about to cost them everything. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle autumn. I should have been walking through Easton's front doors, shaking hands with Richard, maybe taking a tour of what we'd built together. Instead, I stayed home, made coffee, read a book, watched the clock. At 9:15 a.m., Ryan's phone rang. I could hear his voice from the kitchen, pitched higher than usual. "Yes, Mr. Haynes." "No, sir. I don't understand." "Either. He said he'd be there." A pause. "No excuse, sir. I'll handle this immediately." When he hung up, I could feel the heat of his embarrassment radiating from the living room. A CEO, his boss, had called personally about a janitor who didn't show up for work. In Ryan's corporate world, that was the kind of humiliation that followed you into performance reviews. He found me in the kitchen, reading the sports section like I didn't have a care in the world. "Dad." His voice was tight, controlled. "You were supposed to start work today." I looked up with what I hoped was confusion mixed with dawning realization. "Today? Was it Monday already?" I set down the paper slowly, like my old brain was trying to process this information. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I guess I got my days mixed up." "You got your days mixed up?" Ryan's face was turning red. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Mr. Haynes called me personally. The CEO of the company called me about a janitor position." I stood up carefully, playing the part of a man whose bones creaked with age. "I'm really sorry, son. Old age, you know. Sometimes things just slip my mind." He wanted to yell. I could see it building behind his eyes, the frustration, the professional humiliation, the desire to unleash 40 years of suppressed resentment. But he couldn't. He needed me compliant, cooperative. Anger would only push me back into stubbornness. He took a deep breath, visible effort at control. "Just be there tomorrow night, okay? 8 o'clock sharp. Don't make me look like more of an idiot than I already do." After he left for work, Tracy cornered me in the hallway. Her sharp accountant's mind had been working through the implications. "You realize Ryan stuck his neck out for you, right? If you screw this up, it affects his standing at the company." I nodded earnestly. I won't let him down again. But she wasn't finished. Because if you do, if you embarrass him or make him look unreliable, that reflects on both of us. And then we'll have bigger problems than just your employment situation. That evening, I sat in my small bedroom with a lockbox I'd kept hidden in my closet for years. Inside were documents that told the real story of Harold Bennett. Partnership agreements with Richard Haynes, dated and notarized. Quarterly dividend statements showing steady growth over 2 decades. Stock certificates issued before Easton Dynamics went public. Bank records of silent investments, patient capital, and the kind of long-term thinking that builds empires. I also pulled out my laptop and began researching Tracy more carefully. Her work patterns, her company's client list, her habit of leaving sensitive documents scattered across the kitchen counter when she worked from home. I'd noticed irregularities, small things, inconsistencies in the invoices and expense reports she left carelessly visible. Numbers that didn't quite add up, vendor codes that seemed duplicated, training expenses that appeared unusually frequent. Tracy Barrett Bennett was smart, ambitious, and careful, but she was also arrogant, and arrogance makes people sloppy. I started a file on my computer, screenshots of documents she'd left open, photos of invoice templates, notes about her schedule, her private phone calls, her sudden mood swings when certain clients contacted her. The picture emerging wasn't pretty, but it was useful. By midnight, I had enough preliminary evidence to suggest Tracy had been skimming money from her consulting firm. Nothing definitive yet, but patterns that any forensic accountant would recognize. I made a note to contact Gregory Shaw, an old friend who'd specialized in white-collar crime investigation before his retirement. Tuesday morning, I got up early and put on the janitorial uniform Ryan had brought home. Navy blue shirt, matching pants, work boots that had seen better days. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw exactly what Ryan and Tracy wanted to see. A broken-down old man, grateful for whatever scraps they threw his way. Perfect. I arrived at Easton Dynamics at exactly 8 p.m., pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies through the same lobby I'd walked through as an investor decades ago. The security guard, a young kid who probably wasn't even born when I'd helped design this building's security protocols, checked my ID and pointed me toward the service elevator. "First night?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Looking forward to earning my keep." The irony was thick enough to choke on. I was earning my keep in a building I'd helped finance, working for a company I'd helped create, taking orders from a son who had no idea what legacy actually meant. But as I pushed that cart through the halls of Easton Dynamics, something interesting happened. Nobody sees janitors. They're invisible background noise in the corporate symphony, which meant I could go anywhere, hear anything, see everything, and document it all without raising a single eyebrow. I started with Ryan's floor, mapping the layout, noting which offices stayed late, which employees worked overtime, which managers actually managed, and which ones just played politics. Ryan's desk was exactly what I'd expected, cluttered with half-finished projects, buried under the kind of paperwork that suggests a man who's always behind but never catches up. I watched him through the next week, this stranger who shared my last name. Watched him take credit for other people's work in meetings. Watched him duck responsibility when projects went sideways. Watched him spend 2 hours at lunch and call it client development. Most importantly, I watched him overcompensate for the janitor situation by throwing his weight around with subordinates, micromanaging projects he didn't understand, and generally making himself the kind of middle manager people complain about at happy hour. Every mistake, every misstep, every moment of incompetence went into my growing file. At home, Tracy's behavior became increasingly erratic. Late-night phone calls, sudden trips to client meetings that didn't appear on her usual schedule, defensive reactions to simple questions about her day. And through it all, I played my role perfectly. The grateful father, the submissive employee, the old man who'd learned his place. They had no idea they were living with a man who'd spent decades learning patience, strategy, and the art of long-term planning. They saw weakness where there was calculation. They assumed surrender where there was preparation. Tomorrow, I'd continue mopping floors and emptying trash cans. I'd nod respectfully when Ryan's coworkers made jokes about nepotism. I'd accept their condescension with humble grace. But underneath, every step was weaponized. Every smile was a countdown. Every "yes, sir" and "thank you" was another brick in the wall I was building around their comfortable little world. The fuse was set. All that remained was lighting the match. They thought I was mopping floors. In reality, I was scrubbing away their illusions. 2 weeks into my janitorial career at Easton Dynamics, I'd established a rhythm that would have impressed any corporate efficiency expert. 8 p.m. sharp, I'd badge in through the employee entrance, nod respectfully to security, and begin my nightly tour of the building I'd helped design. My cart became a mobile intelligence station, equipped with cleaning supplies that masked sophisticated surveillance equipment I'd quietly acquired. Every floor told a story. Every office revealed secrets. And my son Ryan's story was becoming clearer each night. Tuesday evening, I was emptying trash cans on the 7th floor when I witnessed what would become Exhibit A in Ryan's professional destruction. He was in Conference Room C, supposedly leading a client presentation for Henderson Logistics, a potential $1 million account. I could see everything through the glass walls as I worked. Ryan stood at the head of the table, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation with the confidence of a man who'd actually created it. The slides were impressive. Detailed route optimization charts, cost-benefit analyses, implementation timelines. Professional work that might actually land the contract. There was just one problem. I'd seen Jennifer Walsh from the analytics department working on those exact slides 3 days earlier, staying past midnight to perfect the calculations. Ryan had simply copied her presentation, changed the title slide, and was now taking full credit in front of the client. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check a text message, and recorded 2 minutes of Ryan's performance. Crystal clear audio of him saying, "As you can see from the analysis I developed, we can reduce your shipping costs by 18% in the first quarter alone." The meeting went well. Henderson's procurement manager seemed impressed. Ryan was practically glowing when he shook hands and promised to send the proposal by Friday. As the clients left, I heard him call Jennifer. "Walsh, yeah, I need that Henderson proposal polished up and ready by end of week. Great presentation tonight, by the way. Really sealed the deal." He paused, listening. "What do you mean you haven't finished the cost projections?" "I just promised them the full breakdown by Friday." I could hear Jennifer's voice through his phone, high-pitched with stress. She was explaining that the presentation he'd just given was only preliminary work, that she'd need another week to verify the numbers and ensure accuracy. Ryan's response was pure corporate politics. "Look, I don't want to hear about your scheduling problems. You knew this was priority 1. If you can't handle the workload, maybe we need to reassess your role on the team." That conversation went into my file as Exhibit B. By the end of the week, I had Exhibit C through J documented with similar precision. But Ryan's professional incompetence was only half the story unfolding around me. The other half was playing out at home, where Tracy's increasingly erratic behavior was painting a picture that any forensic accountant would recognize. It started with small things. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into a room, her laptop snapping shut whenever someone approached her workspace at the kitchen table. Sudden client dinners that lasted until well past midnight, leaving her exhausted and defensive the next morning. Friday evening, opportunity presented itself in the form of a spilled coffee cup. Tracy was working late again, her laptop open on the kitchen counter, surrounded by printed invoices and expense reports. She'd gotten careless, leaving sensitive documents scattered across the surface while she made phone calls in the next room. I was washing dishes, playing the role of helpful household member, when I accidentally knocked over her coffee mug with my elbow. "Oh, damn it," I muttered, loud enough for her to hear in the living room. "Tracy, I'm so sorry. I spilled coffee all over your work area." She rushed in, panic flashing across her face before she controlled it. "It's fine, Harold. Just grab some paper towels." But in those few seconds of panic, I'd seen everything I needed. Her laptop screen showed two versions of the same invoice from Morrison Construction Services. One showed a payment of $1,200 for facility maintenance consulting. The other, partially hidden behind a browser window, showed the same invoice number, but listed $1,800 for the same services. While she frantically dabbed coffee from her papers, I memorized every detail I could see. Vendor codes, payment dates, the subtle differences between legitimate invoices and their inflated counterparts. Tracy wasn't just skimming money. She was running a sophisticated billing scam that probably extended back months, maybe years. "Really, Harold, I've got this under control," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Of course, dear. I'll just finish these dishes and get out of your way." That weekend, I called Gregory Shaw, an old friend who'd spent 30 years investigating white-collar crime before retiring to a fishing cabin on Whidbey Island. Greg owed me a favor from way back, and he was exactly the kind of detail-oriented professional who could turn my suspicions into courtroom-ready evidence. "Harold Bennett," he said when he picked up the phone. "It's been what, 5 years? Please tell me you're not calling because you're in trouble." "Not me, Greg, but I need your expertise on something delicate." "Family situation." I explained what I'd observed, sent him photos of the documents I'd managed to capture, and asked him to run some preliminary checks against public vendor databases. Greg's response came back Monday morning via encrypted email. "Your instincts are correct," he wrote. "The invoices show clear signs of systematic inflation. Based on the patterns you've documented, I'd estimate your daughter-in-law has embezzled somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 over the past 8 months. The vendor codes don't match legitimate business registrations, and several of the training expenses you photographed correspond to luxury purchases rather than professional development." He'd attached a detailed analysis that would have impressed any prosecutor. Greg had cross-referenced Tracy's suspicious invoices with actual vendor records, identified the fake companies she'd created to facilitate the embezzlement, and even tracked some of the stolen money to personal credit card payments and cash withdrawals. "If you want to pursue this," his email continued, "I can provide a full forensic report that would stand up in court. But Harold, this is your family we're talking about." "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about $24,500 in college tuition, $9,200 for a wedding, and countless acts of generosity that had been repaid with demands that I find work flipping burgers or cleaning toilets. I started typing my response. "Prepare the full report. And Greg, make it comprehensive." Tuesday night at Easton Dynamics, I had a different kind of work to do. Richard Haynes typically worked late on Tuesdays, handling West Coast client calls that ran past normal business hours. I timed my cleaning route to coincide with his schedule. Richard's corner office was exactly what you'd expect from a successful CEO. Modern furniture, awards covering one wall, and a view of Elliott Bay that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries. What most people didn't know was that some of those awards had my name on the original incorporation documents, buried in legal language that kept my involvement private. I was emptying his wastebasket when he looked up from his computer. "Excuse me," he said, studying my face with the kind of attention that made my pulse quicken. "Have we met before? You look familiar." I straightened up slowly, maintaining the posture of a deferential employee. "I don't believe so, sir. I'm Harold Bennett, night janitorial staff." Bennett. He frowned, clearly trying to place the name. "Are you related to Ryan Bennett in operations?" "Yes, sir. He's my son. Richard's expression shifted slightly. Something wasn't quite adding up for him, and I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. In all the years I'd known him, Richard had never been stupid. Patient, strategic, willing to wait for information to come to him rather than jumping to conclusions. It's one of the reasons his company had succeeded where others failed. Interesting, he said finally. Ryan mentioned his father was looking for work, but I didn't realize. He trailed off, studying me more intently. How long have you been in Seattle, Mr. Bennett? The question was casual, but I recognized it for what it was, a probe. Richard was starting to connect dots, and I needed to be careful about how much information I revealed. Most of my life, sir. Worked in freight logistics for 40 years before I retired. Freight logistics. Now his attention was fully focused on me. Which company? Maritime Pacific Freight, sir. Nothing as impressive as Easton Dynamics, of course. He nodded slowly, but I could see him filing away information, cross-referencing what he knew about Ryan with what he was learning about Ryan's father. In the corporate world, details mattered. And the detail that a janitor had 40 years of logistics experience was the kind of anomaly that raised questions. Well, he said finally, I hope you're finding the work satisfactory. Very much so, sir. It's honest work, and I appreciate the opportunity. I finished emptying his trash and moved on to the next office, but I could feel his eyes following me. Richard Haynes had built a multi-million-dollar company by recognizing when things didn't add up. And something about Harold Bennett, the janitor, wasn't adding up. Wednesday morning brought the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Tracy left her laptop unattended while she took a shower, and for the first time in weeks, she'd forgotten to close her browser windows. I had maybe 10 minutes before she finished her morning routine. Moving quickly but carefully, I photographed everything on her screen. Email correspondences with fake vendors, bank account information, a spreadsheet that tracked her various embezzlement schemes with the kind of detailed organization that would have been impressive if it wasn't criminal. The most damning evidence was an email thread with someone named Marcus Chen, apparently her contact at a company called Pacific Northwest Business Solutions. The emails made it clear that Marcus was helping Tracy create fraudulent invoices in exchange for a percentage of the stolen money. Remember, one email read, keep individual amounts under $2,000. Anything higher triggers automatic review by their accounting department. Tracy's response was equally incriminating. Understood. The quarterly training expenses should be perfect cover for the next round. My boss never questions professional development costs. I was photographing the last email when I heard the shower shut off upstairs. Moving quickly, I closed the browser windows, returned the laptop to its original position, and was calmly reading the morning paper when Tracy came downstairs 20 minutes later. Morning, Harold, she said, checking her laptop screen briefly before closing it. If she noticed anything unusual, she didn't show it. Morning, dear. Coffee's fresh. That afternoon, I sent Gregory Shaw the new evidence. His response came back within hours. This is prosecution-level material. With what you've gathered, any competent district attorney could secure a conviction for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The documentation is that comprehensive. I saved Greg's email in a folder labeled Phase 2 and began composing what would become the most important message I'd ever written. The email to Lennox and Frost Consulting's managing director was a masterpiece of professional whistleblowing, polite, factual, and devastating. I laid out Tracy's embezzlement scheme with surgical precision, attaching Gregory Shaw's forensic analysis and the photographic evidence I'd gathered over the past weeks. The subject line read, Urgent, financial irregularities requiring immediate investigation. I explained that I was a concerned party who had discovered evidence of systematic billing fraud by one of their senior accountants. I provided Tracy's full name, employee ID number, and detailed documentation of her crimes. The email concluded with a suggestion that a comprehensive audit might uncover additional irregularities. I read through the message 4 times, checking every detail, every attachment, every word that might reveal my identity or compromise the investigation. It was perfect, professional, anonymous, and absolutely destructive. For several minutes, I sat staring at the send button, thinking about the consequences of what I was about to do. Tracy would be fired, probably prosecuted. Ryan's career would be damaged by association. Their comfortable life would collapse like a house of cards. Then I remembered Tracy's voice from that first night. "We'll take his pension. Put him somewhere quiet." I remembered Ryan's condescending lecture about household finances and his casual suggestion that I flip burgers for a living. I remembered 40 years of hard work dismissed as worthless, $24,500 in college tuition forgotten, and a lifetime of sacrifice reduced to begging. My finger moved to the mouse. The cursor hovered over Send. Click. The email disappeared from my outbox, carrying with it the first brick in their carefully constructed castle. Somewhere across town, in a glass office building, a managing director was about to discover that one of his most trusted employees was a thief. I closed my laptop, made myself a cup of tea, and sat back to wait for the explosion that would follow. The fuse had been lit. Now came the fireworks. They spent years rehearsing a life without me. Let's see how well they perform without a script. The explosion came faster than I'd anticipated. Thursday afternoon, I was reading in the living room when Tracy burst through the front door at 2:30 p.m., 4 hours earlier than her usual schedule. Her face was the color of old concrete, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her purse and keys. Ryan looked up from his laptop, where he'd been working from home on what he'd called strategic planning, but looked more like online shopping to me. "Trace, what are you doing home so early?" She dropped into a chair like her legs had given out. "I've been suspended." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Ryan's laptop slipped from his knees, clattering onto the coffee table. "Suspended? What the hell are you talking about?" "Pending investigation." Her voice was hollow, mechanical. "They called me into Henderson's office this morning with someone from legal and someone from accounting I'd never seen before. Said there were anonymous allegations about financial irregularities in my accounts." I turned a page in my book, a biography of Warren Buffett that seemed appropriately ironic, and continued reading as if their conversation was background noise. But I was memorizing every word. "Anonymous allegations." Ryan's voice pitched higher. "What kind of allegations?" "They wouldn't give me details. Just said they'd received documentation suggesting systematic billing fraud, and that pending a full forensic audit, I was suspended without pay." Tracy's hands were still shaking. "Ryan, they have documents, amounts, dates, even photos of invoices. The beautiful thing about watching your enemies destroy themselves is the way they reveal information they'd never share under normal circumstances." Tracy was so panicked, she was giving me a real-time assessment of my own handiwork. "Photos?" Ryan was leaning forward now, corporate problem-solver mode kicking in. "How could they have photos unless what? Unless someone was spying on me, photographing my work." Tracy's panic was morphing into paranoia. "Who would do something like that?" They both turned to look at me. I glanced up from my book with mild curiosity. "Everything all right? You both look upset." "Dad," Ryan's voice carried a new edge of suspicion. "Tracy's having some trouble at work. Someone apparently made anonymous accusations about her finances." I set down my book, adopting the expression of a concerned family member. "Oh my, that sounds serious. Is there anything I can do to help?" Tracy studied my face like she was trying to read a foreign language. Have you been around when I was working from home? Maybe seen anyone unusual in the neighborhood? Well, I'm here most days, of course, but I try to stay out of your way when you're working. You seem to prefer privacy for your business calls. It was the truth, technically. I had stayed out of her way. I'd just been extremely observant while doing it. That evening, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Ryan was pacing the living room, making phone calls to friends in accounting and legal fields, trying to understand what Tracy might be facing. Tracy sat at the kitchen table with her laptop closed, staring into space like she was calculating the trajectory of her falling world. I made dinner, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs, and tried to project the calming presence of an elder who'd seen troubles come and go. Inside, I was counting down to the next phase of my plan. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, I offered as we sat down to eat. Companies investigate things all the time. Usually turns out to be accounting errors or miscommunications. Ryan grabbed onto this lifeline eagerly. Dad's right. It's probably just bureaucratic nonsense, some jealous coworker trying to make trouble. But Tracy wasn't buying false comfort. Ryan, they had specific documents, invoice numbers, payment amounts. This isn't some random accusation. Someone put together a detailed case. Who would do that, though? Who even has access to your work files? Tracy's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. That's what I can't figure out. The documents they mentioned. Some of them I never shared with anyone, never printed, never emailed. She was starting to understand the scope of her problem, and watching that realization dawn was more satisfying than I'd expected. Friday morning brought a new level of tension. Ryan was scheduled to work from the office, but Tracy's suspension had him rattled. He kept checking his phone, jumping every time it buzzed. "What if this affects me at work?" he asked Tracy over coffee. "If they arrest you or something, how does that look for my career?" "Gee, thanks for the support, honey. Really feeling the love here." "I'm just saying, we need to think strategically about damage control. Maybe you should hire a lawyer." "With what money? They froze my accounts pending the investigation, remember?" This was news to me, and excellent news at that. A frozen bank account meant Tracy's embezzlement had been taken seriously enough to warrant immediate financial protective measures. Gregory Shaw's forensic report had apparently been quite convincing. I left for my night shift at Easton Dynamics with a lighter step than usual. The first domino was falling exactly as planned, and tonight I had more dominoes to arrange. Richard Haynes had been working late more frequently, and I'd noticed him paying closer attention to my movements through the building. Tuesday night, he'd nodded when I passed his office. Wednesday, he'd asked about my previous logistics experience. Thursday, he'd seemed on the verge of saying something more substantial before a phone call interrupted us. Tonight, that conversation was going to happen, whether he initiated it or not. I timed my route to clean the executive floor during Richard's usual 8:30 p.m. conference call with West Coast clients. The call ran long, which gave me plenty of time to work in the adjacent conference room while listening to his voice through the glass partition. Richard Haynes had always been a decisive leader, but he'd also been blessed with an exceptional memory for details. I was counting on both qualities tonight. When his call ended, I was emptying trash cans just outside his office. He opened his door and saw me immediately. "Mr. Bennett." His tone was formal, but not unfriendly. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, sir." He gestured me into his office and closed the door, an unusual step for a CEO to take with janitorial staff. I sat in the chair across from his desk, maintaining the posture of a respectful employee while mentally preparing for what I hoped would be a career-defining conversation. "I've been thinking about our previous conversations," Richard began, studying my face with that same intense attention I remembered from our early business meetings decades ago. 40 years in freight logistics is impressive experience. Maritime Pacific Freight, you said? Yes, sir. I knew some people at Maritime Pacific back in the day. Good company. Traditional approach to logistics management. He paused, watching my reaction. What did you do there, exactly? This was the moment I'd been building toward. The careful revelation that would shift the entire balance of power in this building. Started in operations, sir. Worked my way up through route planning, client relations, eventually some strategic partnerships and investment consulting. Investment consulting. Richard leaned back in his chair. Interesting. That's quite a progression from operations. The logistics industry was changing rapidly in the 1990s, sir. Companies that understood both operational efficiency and financial strategy had significant advantages. I could see him processing this information, cross-referencing it with what he knew about Ryan, about my employment situation, about the anomalies that had been nagging at him all week. Mr. Bennett, he said slowly, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. I nodded. Do you know who I am? I mean, do you know anything about my background, the history of this company? The moment of truth. I could continue playing the humble janitor, maintain my cover until Ryan's destruction was complete. Or I could trust Richard's intelligence and integrity. Reveal enough truth to enlist him as an ally rather than an observer. I know you built Easton Dynamics from nothing, sir. Started with 3 employees in a rented garage, focused on freight optimization software when most companies were still using paper-based systems. I know you took significant personal and financial risks to pursue a vision that most people thought was ahead of its time. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. That's very specific knowledge for someone who's never worked in corporate software development. I've always followed the industry closely, sir. Success stories like yours tend to be well documented in logistics trade publications. It was a careful non-answer, but Richard wasn't the type to be satisfied with evasions. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file folder I hadn't expected to see. I pulled some old incorporation documents yesterday, he said, opening the folder. Early investor records, partnership agreements, things I hadn't looked at in years. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Interesting reading. Reminded me of some people who were instrumental in getting this company off the ground. He looked up from the papers. People whose contributions might have been forgotten by some, but not by me. The silence stretched between us. Richard was giving me an opportunity to come clean, to acknowledge what we both knew, but hadn't said aloud. Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at. He smiled, not the polite smile of a CEO making small talk, but the knowing smile of a man who'd solved a puzzle that had been bothering him all week. Harold Bennett. Not just any Harold Bennett, but the Harold Bennett who wrote me a $500,000 check in 1999 when 3 banks had already turned me down for a business loan. The game was up. 26 years of anonymity dissolved in a single sentence. Hello, Richard. His laugh was genuine, filled with equal parts amazement and admiration. You magnificent bastard. What the hell are you doing cleaning toilets in your own building? I told him everything. The retirement dinner, Ryan and Tracy's demands, the systematic humiliation and threats, the way they'd used his name to secure me a janitor position, never imagining I might actually know the CEO of Easton Dynamics personally. Richard listened without interruption, his expression shifting from amusement to disbelief to cold anger. Your son told me you were desperate for work, said you had no relevant job experience and needed charity employment to avoid being a burden on his family. That's an accurate representation of his perspective, yes. And now, he works here, in my company, taking salary from a business you helped build, while treating you like a burden who should be grateful for minimum wage work. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing the full scope of what I'd revealed. When he spoke again, his voice carried the edge of a man who'd built an empire and didn't appreciate being lied to. "What do you want me to do about this, Harold?" It was exactly the question I'd been hoping he'd ask. Nothing you wouldn't do for any investor who'd been defrauded by an employee. Ryan has been misrepresenting his qualifications, taking credit for other people's work, and using family connections to secure employment under false pretenses. Richard nodded slowly. "And what about your current employment situation?" "I'll finish out the week, maintain appearances until the situation resolves itself naturally." "Naturally?" Richard's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You know, Harold, I've always admired your strategic thinking. This might be your masterpiece." We shook hands, two old partners reconnecting after years of separation. As I left his office, pushing my janitor cart toward the service elevator, I felt lighter than I had in months. The second domino was positioned perfectly. All that remained was waiting for Ryan to push it over himself. Walking home through the quiet Seattle streets, I thought about Tracy sitting at our kitchen table, staring into the wreckage of her career, about Ryan lying awake, wondering if his wife's criminal charges would destroy his professional reputation. They'd wanted me to learn my place in their carefully ordered world. Tomorrow, they'd start learning theirs in mine. They built their lives on borrowed legacy. Today, the lender comes to collect. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm. I woke before dawn, made coffee, and sat in my small bedroom reviewing the files I'd compiled over the past month. Tonight would be different. Tonight, the mask came off permanently. At Easton Dynamics, I pushed my janitor cart through the familiar halls one last time, but there was steel in my spine that hadn't been there before. Richard had spent the weekend preparing, and I could feel the anticipation building like electricity in the air. Ryan was strutting around the 7th floor with his usual combination of arrogance and insecurity, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. I watched him through the conference room glass as he conducted his morning team meeting, taking credit for Jennifer Walsh's Henderson Logistics presentation that had secured the contract last week. "The key to my success with Henderson," he was telling his team, "was understanding their operational pain points and developing targeted solutions." Jennifer sat at the far end of the table, her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned not to challenge Ryan's version of events, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. That frustration was about to be validated in ways she couldn't imagine. At exactly 10 a.m., Richard's assistant made an announcement over the building's intercom system. "All 7th floor staff, please gather in conference room A for a brief company meeting." Ryan looked pleased, probably assuming this was some kind of recognition for his Henderson success. He straightened his tie and walked into the conference room with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. I positioned myself in the hallway, emptying trash cans with a clear view through the glass walls. What was about to happen needed witnesses, and I intended to see every moment. Richard entered the room accompanied by two people Ryan wouldn't recognize: Margaret Foster from Human Resources and David Chen from Legal. The atmosphere shifted immediately from casual to formal. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. "I want to introduce someone who's been working in our building for the past few weeks." He stepped aside, and I walked through the conference room doors, no longer pushing a cart, no longer wearing the servile expression that had become my costume. I stood straight, shoulders back, meeting every eye in the room with the quiet confidence of a man who owned 37% of everything they could see. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Harold Bennett, not our janitor, as some of you may have assumed, but one of the founding investors of Easton Dynamics and a member of our board of directors." The silence was absolute. Jennifer Walsh's mouth fell open. Two junior analysts exchanged bewildered looks, and Ryan turned the color of fresh concrete, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers to shatter on the conference table. Mr. Bennett has been conducting what you might call an undercover assessment of our operations, Richard continued, his tone professionally neutral but with edges sharp enough to draw blood. His findings have been quite illuminating. I stepped forward, my voice calm and measured. For the past month, I've had the unique opportunity to observe this department's workflow, management practices, and professional standards from an unusual perspective. My eyes found Ryan, who was staring at me like I'd risen from the dead. What I discovered was a pattern of misrepresentation, credit theft, and professional misconduct that requires immediate correction. Margaret Foster opened a file folder. Ryan Bennett, you're terminated effective immediately for falsification of work product, misrepresentation of qualifications, and violation of company ethics policies. Ryan's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. "This is impossible," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't do this. I have a mortgage, responsibilities." "You had responsibilities," Richard cut him off. "To this company, to your team, and to the investors who trusted you with their resources. You failed all of them." I watched my son crumble in real time. The corporate authority he'd worn like armor dissolved, leaving behind a middle-aged man who'd built his entire identity on borrowed competence and inherited connections. "Did you really think," I said quietly, "that I wouldn't recognize my own company?" The meeting dispersed quickly after that. Jennifer Walsh looked stunned, but relieved. The other team members filed out in silence, already calculating how Ryan's departure would affect their own positions. Ryan sat alone at the conference table, staring at the papers Margaret Foster had left behind, termination documents, final paycheck calculations, and a security escort waiting to clean out his desk. I didn't speak to him as he was led away. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I came home to find Tracy's suitcases by the front door. She was sitting at the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the low, desperate tones of someone trying to negotiate with creditors. "Yes, I understand the account is frozen, but surely there's some kind of payment plan we can arrange," she was saying. When she saw me, she ended the call abruptly. "Harold?" Her voice was flat, defeated. "I suppose you know about Ryan. I heard he left Easton Dynamics today." "Left." She laughed bitterly. "Is that what he told you? He was fired, Harold, escorted out by security like a common criminal." I sat down across from her, noting how much she'd aged in the past week. The sharp confidence that had defined Tracy Bennett was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching everything they'd built collapse. "And you?" I asked gently. "How are things at Lennox and Frost?" "There are no things at Lennox and Frost. I've been terminated. They're filing criminal charges." She looked up at me with something approaching recognition. "You know what's funny, Harold? The evidence they had was too good, too comprehensive, like someone had been watching me for months, documenting everything I did." I met her gaze steadily. "Is that what you think happened?" "I think," she said slowly, "that we underestimated you." The front door opened, and Ryan walked in carrying a cardboard box, his personal effects from 20 months at Easton Dynamics. He looked older, diminished, like a man who'd discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself was wrong. "They know," he said to Tracy without looking at me. "Somehow they know everything." Tracy gestured toward me. "He knows too." Ryan finally looked at me directly, and I saw something I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. Genuine fear. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "Planning what?" "Don't." His voice cracked. "Don't pretend you don't know what's happening. Tracy's career is destroyed. I just lost my job. And somehow our fucking janitor father turns out to be a board member of the company that fired me." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 65 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in months. I didn't plan anything, Ryan. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Protecting us? Tracy's voice rose. You destroyed our lives. No, I said quietly. You destroyed your own lives. I just stopped cleaning up the mess. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Ryan's ragged breathing. He slumped into a chair, the cardboard box still clutched in his arms like a life preserver. What happens now? He asked. Now you face the consequences of treating your father like a burden instead of a blessing. Now you learn what it means to lose everything you took for granted. I walked toward the hallway, then turned back to face them both. The house belongs to me, by the way. Always has. I've been paying the mortgage, the taxes, the utilities for the past 2 years. I've decided to sell it. Tracy went white. You can't do that. We have nowhere to go. You have jobs to find and mistakes to answer for. I suggest you start working on both. I left them sitting at the kitchen table. Two people who'd spent their entire relationship assuming they were smarter, more sophisticated, and more deserving than the old man they'd decided was dead weight. That night, I packed my belongings into 3 suitcases. Everything I truly needed fit easily. The rest, furniture, books, 40 years of accumulated possessions, belonged to a version of myself I no longer needed to be. Richard had offered me a furnished condo overlooking Lake Union, a gesture of appreciation that also served as an apology for not recognizing me sooner. I accepted gratefully, not because I needed his charity, but because I was ready to start living like the man I'd always been, instead of the man I'd pretended to be, for my family's sake. As I closed the door behind me for the last time, I could hear Ryan and Tracy arguing in the living room. Their voices carried the sharp edge of panic. Two people realizing that the safety net they'd taken for granted had never actually existed. I walked to my car without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I could see lights on in every window of the house I'd called home for 2 years. They were probably going through papers, trying to understand the full scope of their situation, calculating how long they had before the foreclosure proceedings began. I felt no satisfaction in their panic, but I felt no guilt either. I'd given them every opportunity to treat me with basic human dignity. They'd chosen exploitation instead. The condo Richard had arranged was everything the house wasn't: modern, peaceful, mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the lake that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Seattle in the first place. I made coffee, sat in a comfortable chair I hadn't paid for with humiliation, and opened the morning paper. On the business page was a small item about executive changes at Easton Dynamics. Ryan Bennett's departure was mentioned in a single sentence, buried between announcements about quarterly earnings and new client acquisitions. 40 years of building a career, and his professional obituary merited one line in the local business section. I folded the paper and looked out at the lake, where early morning joggers were beginning their daily routines. People getting up, going to work, building lives based on their own efforts rather than inherited advantages they'd never acknowledged. My phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Board meeting Thursday to discuss your increased involvement. Hope you're ready to stop pretending to be retired. I smiled and typed back, looking forward to getting back to work. For the first time in 2 years, that was actually true. Some retire with gold watches. I chose silence and fire. 6 months later, I woke up in my Lake Union condo to the sound of seabirds and distant traffic, rather than muffled arguments through thin walls. The morning light reflected off the water like scattered diamonds, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely peaceful. My coffee tasted better when I wasn't drinking it in a house where I was treated like an unwelcome guest. The newspaper was more interesting when I could read it without interruption from people demanding I justify my existence. The business section carried a small story about Lennox and Frost Consulting's settlement with federal prosecutors. Tracy had pleaded guilty to embezzlement charges and received 18 months probation, plus full restitution. $23,400, the final tally had been. Her CPA license was permanently revoked. I folded the paper and walked to my desk, where I kept a single-framed photo from the old house. Ryan as a boy, maybe 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed after hitting his first home run in Little League. On the back, I'd written years ago, "One day, I'll teach you what real legacy means." I'd kept that promise, just not in the way I'd originally planned. Richard visited that afternoon, carrying a bottle of the same wine Ryan and I had shared the night I announced my retirement. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Thought we should celebrate properly this time," he said, uncorking the bottle with practiced ease. We sat by the windows, watching sailboats navigate the lake while we talked about the past and future of Easton Dynamics. Richard had restructured Ryan's former department, promoting Jennifer Walsh to lead the team she'd been quietly managing all along. "She's good," he said. "Maybe better than Ryan ever was, and definitely more honest about her contributions." "That's not a high bar to clear," Richard laughed. "True, but she's been asking about you. Wants to know if you'd consider mentoring some of the junior analysts. Apparently, your reputation in logistics strategy is better than I realized." I considered this. I might be interested. On a consulting basis. Speaking of consulting, Richard pulled out a document from his briefcase. "I have something for you." It was a charter for the Harold Bennett Scholarship Fund, seeded with $1.2 million from Easton Dynamics Community Investment Program. The scholarship would support working-class students pursuing business or logistics degrees. "Students who understand the value of hard work," I read from the mission statement, "and the importance of building rather than inheriting success." I thought you'd appreciate the language. I signed the charter, thinking about all the young people who'd benefit from opportunities I'd helped create. Real legacy, built on contribution rather than entitlement. That evening, I walked to the neighborhood cafe I'd started frequenting. The owner, Mrs. Chen, greeted me with the warmth reserved for regular customers who tip well and don't cause trouble. "The usual, Mr. Bennett?" "Please." I took my coffee to the corner table where I could watch the street while reading. The local news section had a small item about a house foreclosure in my old neighborhood. The address was familiar. Ryan and Tracy had lasted 3 months after I left. Without my quiet financial support, the mortgage payments had become impossible on their reduced income. Ryan was working at a freight brokerage firm now, entry-level, the kind of job he might have started with 20 years ago if he'd built his career on merit instead of connections. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no regret either. They'd made their choices with full awareness of the consequences. I'd simply stopped shielding them from reality. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately. "Dad, can we talk? I know I messed up. Maybe we can work something out. Ryan." I stared at the message for a long time, remembering the boy who'd run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that his father could fix anything. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man who saw his father as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I deleted the message without responding. Mrs. Chen refilled my coffee without being asked. "You look thoughtful tonight, Mr. Bennett." "Just reflecting on some recent changes in my life." "Good changes, I hope." I looked out the window at the busy street, watching people head home from work, build their own lives through their own efforts. Young professionals who reminded me of myself 40 years ago, ambitious, hard-working, willing to sacrifice for something bigger than immediate gratification. "Yes," I said. "Very good changes." Back at the condo, I opened my laptop and began working on something I'd been considering for weeks. Richard had asked if I wanted to return to an active role at Easton Dynamics, but I'd realized I preferred consulting to corporate politics. I was designing a business plan for independent logistics consulting, targeting mid-sized companies that needed strategic guidance, but couldn't afford major consulting firms. At 65, I was starting over, but this time I was building something entirely my own, free from the weight of family obligations and the burden of managing other people's expectations. The plan was solid. My reputation in the industry was stronger than I'd realized. And for the first time in decades, I was working for myself rather than for some idealized vision of family harmony that had never actually existed. Late that night, I stood at my living room window, looking out at the lake and the city beyond. Somewhere out there, Ryan and Tracy were probably having another argument about money, blame, and what went wrong. They'd never understand that what went wrong started the moment they decided their father's love was something they were entitled to, rather than something they needed to earn through basic human decency. I'd spent 2 years being treated like a burden by people who'd forgotten that everything they had was built on sacrifices they'd never bothered to acknowledge. I'd given them every opportunity to remember who I was and what I'd contributed to their lives. Instead, they'd chosen to see me as dead weight, a problem to be managed, a source of embarrassment who needed to be grateful for minimum wage work and casual cruelty. So I'd reminded them, in the quietest possible way, that respect flows both directions, that generosity has limits, and that the most dangerous enemy is always the one you underestimate. I poured myself a small glass of wine and raised it toward the window, toward the city, toward the future I was building on my own terms. To retirement, I said aloud, and to finally learning the difference between being alone and being free. The wine tasted perfect, just like everything else in my new life.